Copycats. Dirt roads in Washington weren't like the ones back in Nebraska. Spencer had grown up seeing country highways stretch straight and open toward the horizon, interrupted only by the occasional wheat field, gas station, or power line. But this winding, tree-choked corridor felt more like a path carved into something older and darker. The forest pressed in from both sides, thick with fir and cedar, and what little sky was visible above the canopy had begun to dull. From the sharp clarity of morning to the pale haze of early afternoon, it was beautiful in the way that deep water was beautiful, something to be admired from a distance, not trusted. He didn't say any of this aloud. Clarissa was playing music through her phone, something ambient and reverb-heavy, while Ava scrolled through photos from the trail they'd stopped at earlier. Ricky had his arm slung over the steering wheel like he was born with it there, the knuckles of his right hand tapping the dashboard in rhythm with the song. The car was an old forest green Jeep Cherokee with too many bumper stickers and a 5-inch crack in the passenger side window. It had no business running as smoothly as it did, but Ricky had a way with machines, and with people for that matter. Spencer still wasn't sure whether he liked that or not. "You ever been this far out?" Ricky asked, glancing at him in the rear view. Spencer shrugged. "Not really. My family didn't camp much." Clarissa laughed from the passenger seat. "Spence thinks anything west of Seattle is cryptid country." "It is cryptid country," Ava said, not looking up. "We passed a road called Devil's Glen 2 turns ago. Come on." Ricky smirked. "That's not even the worst of it. You want stories? I'll give you stories." Clarissa rolled her eyes, but leaned closer to him anyway, adjusting the angle of her sunglasses. "Save it for the fire, Ranger boy." It was the first time Spencer had been invited to do anything since moving into the dorms 3 weeks ago. He had met Clarissa and Ava through Intro to Media Studies, and Ricky had shown up 2 days later when Clarissa dragged Spencer to a house party. Ricky didn't seem like the college type. He was a couple of years older, didn't talk about classes, and had the relaxed confidence of someone who'd already seen things worth keeping to himself. When he offered to drive them all out to a place where you could actually see stars, Spencer had said yes before he could talk himself out of it. The car rounded a bend, and the road narrowed again, a thin slice of gravel flanked by steep ditches and undergrowth so dense it looked like a wall. That was when the Jeep hit something. There was a sudden thump beneath the front passenger tire, followed by a sound like wet bark snapping. The whole vehicle lurched. Spencer's shoulder slammed into the door. Clarissa cursed and braced herself against the dash as Ricky slammed on the brakes and veered them onto the shallow, weed-choked shoulder. "Jesus," Ava muttered. "What was that?" Ricky threw the car into park and got out without answering. Spencer opened his door more carefully and stepped into the gravel, immediately feeling the soft give beneath his sneakers. He walked around to the front and saw the tire, shredded. A jagged piece of wood jutted out from beneath the wheel well, broken at an angle that could only be described as purposeful. It wasn't a branch, it was a spike. Hand-carved, bark-stripped, sharp enough to puncture through heavy-duty rubber. "Someone left that there on purpose," Clarissa said, joining. "Them?" Ricky crouched beside the tire, running his fingers along the edge of the hole. "Yeah," he muttered. "Looks that way." They spent the next 5 minutes confirming what they already suspected. There was no signal, not even a flicker of a bar, and the nearest town, if Ricky was remembering right, was at least 5 miles back down the road. The air had grown hotter since they'd left the last highway, and the drone of insects was starting to rise in the silence between them. "Well," Ricky said at last, standing and wiping his hands on his jeans, "we're not getting a tow out here, not without hiking back." Clarissa groaned. "Can't we wait until someone drives by? You've seen the map. This road's pretty well off-grid. Might have been an old service trail at some point." He looked down the empty curve of forest stretching ahead of them, then back at the others. "I'll go. I can make better time solo. You all stay here." Ava raised an eyebrow. "Are you serious?" Ricky turned toward the Jeep, opened the driver's door, and reached under the seat. When he stood up, there was a compact black pistol in his hand. "Yeah," he said, as if that explained everything. Clarissa's mouth fell open. You brought a gun? I always bring it when I come out here. Why? He looked at each of them in turn before answering. There are stories. Stuff people don't talk about much. Mimics. Skinwalkers. You've heard of them, right? Things that wear your face but get it wrong. The locals here call them copycats. Okay, Ava said, crossing her arms. Copycats. Right. Now I know you're screwing with us. I'm not, Ricky said, and the gravity in his voice startled even Spencer. If something comes back here looking like me, don't open the doors, don't talk to it, don't trust it. Ask it questions. Specific ones, only I'll know the answers. Clarissa laughed again, nervously this time. You're serious? I am. Ricky took a deep breath. Ask me what I was drinking when I met you, Clarissa. Ask me what's tattooed on my back. Ask me what kind of dog my sister used to have. If it gets any of those wrong, it's not me. He tucked the gun into the waistband of his jeans, tightened the straps of his backpack, and nodded once. Windows up, doors locked, stay in the car. Then he turned and walked down the road, vanishing into the heat shimmer between the trees before anyone could argue. For a while, they said nothing. The quiet that followed Ricky's departure stretched on. Even the insects, constant in background, before seemed to have lessened their chorus. Spencer watched the ripple of dust settle on the Jeep's hood, then leaned back against the headrest, hands folded tightly in his lap. Clarissa, true to form, was the first to break the tension. She reached forward to turn the music back on, something dreamy and low tempo, and cranked the window down 2 inches. So, she said, dragging the word out. We're not going to pretend that wasn't insane, right? Ava let out a short, brittle laugh. You mean the mimic bullshit or the gun? Both, Clarissa said, stretching. That was some prepper core lunacy. Like, was that a warning, or was he messing with us? We're not about to get pranked. Are we? Spencer didn't respond. He was watching the bend in the road where Ricky had vanished, half expecting him to come trudging back with a grin and some reveal that it had all been an elaborate prank. But the way he'd looked, serious, almost frightened, that hadn't been part of a bit, not even close. I mean, if we're going to be here a while, Clarissa said, already swinging the door open, I'd rather not bake alive. Spencer sat forward. Wait. Ricky said to stay in the car. Clarissa leaned against the doorframe, one leg extended, her sunglasses now perched atop her head. Yeah, well, Ricky also said a forest cryptid was going to come back wearing his face. I think we can risk some fresh air. Before Spencer could protest further, she climbed out. The sky had cleared completely by then, and the sun filtered in through the breaks in the trees, dappling the gravel and the moss-covered embankments in gold. Clarissa stood in it like it was a spotlight, arms raised above her head as she stretched, revealing a pale strip of stomach above her jeans. Ava climbed into the back seat beside Spencer, eyeing him sideways. You know she's doing that for your benefit, right? I'm aware, Spencer muttered. She flirts with everyone, it doesn't mean anything. He nodded, though the flush in his ears suggested otherwise. Clarissa, meanwhile, had hoisted herself onto the roof of the Jeep. She peeled off her tank top with theatrical flair, revealing a black sports bra underneath, and lay back against the metal, soaking in the warmth. She turned her head slightly to regard him. You coming up here, Spence? You look like you could use some vitamin D. You're paler than the underbelly of a trout. Spencer hesitated. The air smelled sweet and green, the kind of scent you never found in cities. Somewhere in the distance, a jay let out a single harsh cry. Clarissa was smiling at him now, hand extended in mock invitation. Her legs were crossed at the ankles, toes flexing in the sun. He looked at Ava, who raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Then he glanced again at the road. Nothing moved. The breeze stirred the tops of the trees and caused a few shadows to shift along the ground, but otherwise, the world held still. He imagined climbing up beside her, maybe laughing, maybe letting the heat of the car's metal roof blur the edges of his worry, maybe kissing her, maybe forgetting for a moment that they were stranded miles from anywhere with no reception and a spike through their tire. But then the memory returned, the way Ricky had turned to him, gaze sharpened by something that wasn't paranoia, but experience. If anything comes back that looks like me, I'm good, Spencer said finally. I'll stay down here. Clarissa sighed in mock disappointment and rested her arms behind her head. Suit yourself, you're missing out. It wasn't the kind of sound any of them had expected, nothing at all like what a person would imitate. It was piercing and unnatural, shrill enough to make the air vibrate, and it seemed to spiral rather than echo, curling into the trees, like it was being absorbed by them. For a few seconds there was only that noise, and then stillness. Movement followed. At first, it was impossible to tell how many shapes were filtering through the forest. The light fractured as it passed between branches, breaking up the forms into pieces, shoulders detached from torsos, limbs merging with trunks. But as they drew closer to the edge of the woods, their bodies became clearer, and the details resolved into something unmistakable. They were all Ricky. These were not exact duplicates, but seemingly purposeful approximations. Some looked fresher than others, their clothes only slightly torn, skin only lightly smudged. Others seemed distorted, faces drawn long, arms too flexible at the joints, eyes bulging slightly from the sockets. Each bore the same general injuries: dirt-streaked arms, twisted shirts, blood at the corners of the mouth or jaw. There were at least 6 of them, maybe more. The trees still moved behind the first wave. They formed a loose semicircle around the Jeep, their heads turning at the same time like synchronized dolls. One moved toward the rear bumper. Another placed a hand on the hood and dragged its fingers slowly across the metal, leaving a smear that looked like grease but smelled like rot. Clarissa made a soft sound in her throat and pulled her knees up into her seat. "Keep driving," she whispered. Spencer pressed harder on the pedal. The Jeep jolted forward again, but the road ahead was narrowing and the steering was becoming harder to control. The imposters didn't chase them, not at first, but followed in slow arcs, keeping pace along the shoulder and ditch, drifting, closer with each second. Then the one by the passenger side mirror raised its arm and drove its elbow down onto the glass. The side mirror snapped off with a sharp crack and landed in the gravel. Ava screamed. Another pounded against the gas tank door with its fist until the latch gave and the flap sprang open. One near the rear window pulled something from its mouth, a metal object bent and stained with saliva. A knife blade, or something that had once resembled one. "We have to get out of here," Ava shouted. "I'm trying," Spencer said. But the Jeep was beginning to resist. With a jolt that nearly sent them into the ditch, he felt the rear give out. The vehicle tilted slightly and groaned beneath them. One of the back tires had gone completely flat. Maybe 2, he looked down at the dash. The warning lights had begun to glow. Pressure failure, traction loss. Then came the smell, the bitter tang of rubber melting against metal. Another figure leapt onto the hood, knees slamming into the frame, palms smearing. Grime across the windshield. It crouched there, head turning mechanically from side to side, teeth clenched so tightly that the gums had begun to bleed. Its eyes locked on Spencer's, and it mouthed something he couldn't hear. Then, louder this time, all of them began to speak at once. "There will be more after nightfall," they said, voices layered together like a choir in reverse. "There will be more. There will be more." The creature on the hood reared back and slammed its forehead into the glass. The windshield spidered but held. Again and again it hammered the vehicle. Clarissa grabbed Spencer's arm. "Do something!" "I can't," he started, but then the entire Jeep rocked hard to the left as one of the creatures wrenched the rear door handle and tried to peel it open. Another slammed its fist into the roof. A third tore the license plate clean off and held it above its head like a trophy. They were playing now, testing them, mocking them, and then, as quickly as it had started, the noise stopped. The creatures froze in place, limbs still raised mid-motion, heads cocked as if listening to some silent cue. One by one, they backed away from the vehicle, retreating into the woods in the same way they had emerged, backward, fluid, silent. The last one to disappear was the original imposter, the one who'd come out of the woods first. It stared at them for several seconds longer than the others. Then it stepped behind a tree and was gone. Spencer let his hands fall from the wheel. The sound of the overheated engine ticked in the sudden quiet. Ava was crying again, this time without restraint. Clarissa looked dazed, her hands shaking in her lap. "We're stuck," Spencer said. Not because they didn't know, but because saying it aloud made it real. Clarissa nodded slowly. "They didn't want to kill us yet. They wanted to scare us," Ava whispered, "because something worse is coming." "Spencer, I don't want to die," Clarissa sobbed. "Isn't there anything we can do?" "I don't know," Spencer said. "I'm sorry." They didn't speak again for several minutes after the imposters vanished. Every sound outside the vehicle seemed suspect. Every rustle of the trees, every shift of gravel beneath the Jeep, every darting shadow across the windshield could have been the return of those things. There was no way to tell whether they had truly gone or were waiting, watching from behind the green curtain of undergrowth, waiting for someone to crack a window or step outside. Clarissa sat curled against the door, her legs drawn up to her, chest arms wrapped around her knees in a posture that suggested both defense and defeat. Ava was clenching and unclenching her fists in her lap, eyes pinned to the road ahead as if sheer will might summon a rescue. Spencer had not removed his hands from the wheel. His knuckles had long since gone white, but he didn't trust himself to let go. Not yet. Then they heard it. Footsteps. Not the crunch and scramble of a creature, but the steady, familiar sound of boots on gravel. Measured. Human. Approaching slowly, cautiously. Ava straightened. Someone's coming. Spencer leaned forward, peering through the fractured windshield. A figure was approaching from the same direction as before. Same gait, same height. But this time something was different. The man had Ricky's build, Ricky's clothes, even Ricky's walk. His shirt was untucked and streaked with dust, but he was holding something in each hand. As he drew closer, it became clear. A cell phone. And the gun. Clarissa gasped. "Oh my God, it's him, it's really him this time." She moved to open the door. "No, Clarissa, stop," Spencer said, putting his hand on hers. "Not so fast. We don't that for sure." The figure stopped 10 feet from the Jeep and raised one arm in greeting. "It's me," he called out. "I made it to town. Took forever to get a signal, but I'm here now. I've got help on the way." He held up the phone like a badge of proof. "And the gun?" Spencer asked. "Still got. It didn't have to use it again." He smiled. "Just lucky, I guess." But even as he stood there, his posture calm and inviting, there was something unnatural in his composure. He didn't appear winded or tense. There was no urgency in his voice, no trace of what someone might sound like after surviving a near-death encounter and traversing miles. He spoke as if he were ordering coffee. Spencer swallowed and opened his window an inch. "You said help is coming?" "They'll be here soon. Sheriff in a tow truck, probably 20 minutes out." Clarissa looked to Spencer. "Ask him." "I know." He focused on the man outside. "What were you drinking when you met Clarissa?" There was a pause, brief but unmistakable. "Beer," the figure said. "Wrong," Spencer replied, cold and flat. The imposter's eyes narrowed, but it smiled again, wider this time. "White Claw, grapefruit, right?" Spencer didn't answer. He continued. "What's tattooed on your back?" "Compass," the thing said too quickly, like a student recalling a cribbed note. Spencer furrowed his brow. "What kind of dog? Did your sister used to have?" That did it. The smile faded. The head tilted, ever so slightly. Then the voice that came from its throat dropped by several degrees. Still asking questions. Still playing the hero. Its fingers flexed around the grip of the gun. "You're starting to piss me off, Spencer." Clarissa let out a sharp breath and jerked back into her seat. Ava reached for the crowbar wedged between the front seats. The creature raised the gun, aiming it toward the car, and for a moment, Spencer thought it was going to fire. But then it fumbled. Its hand slipped against the trigger guard, and in trying to recover, it discharged the weapon directly into its own thigh. The sound was deafening at close range. The creature shrieked, more in frustration than pain, and stumbled back. Blood oozed from the wound, though it was too dark to be entirely human. The thing looked down at the injury, blinked twice, then snarled. "Doesn't matter," it hissed. "Still got 5 more." It raised the gun again and fired, once at the windshield, once at the rear driver's side window, and once into the passenger side door. The glass cracked but didn't break. One bullet punched through the roof, sending a burst of sound-dampening insulation fluttering into the cabin. Clarissa screamed. Ava ducked, clutching her knees. Spencer didn't move. He kept his eyes on the thing's face, noting how its frustration was quickly giving way to rage. It squeezed the trigger again, but this time there was only a click. Empty. The creature stared at the gun, confused. Then it dropped it, baring its teeth. "You don't deserve to die quickly," it said. Then it turned and limped away, dragging its leg behind it like a broken marionette. It disappeared into the brush once more, leaving only the echo of its words and the smell of powder and hot metal in its wake. Inside the car, the silence broke. Clarissa burst into sobs, curled up in the passenger seat with her face buried in her hands. Ava was muttering to herself under her breath, her words low and directionless. Spencer sat back, blinking at the bullet hole in the ceiling above him. A shaft of light bled through it, soft and gold, wholly indifferent. "They're not going to stop," Ava said. "Not until one of us breaks." "We're not breaking," Spencer said. "Not before nightfall, not after. We're getting out. Of here, all of us." "You saw what it did," Clarissa sobbed. "It's learning. Each one's more convincing than the last. That one had the phone, the gun. It knew most of the answers." Spencer nodded. "But it didn't know all of them. That's what matters." Clarissa looked up. "What do we do?" He reached down and pulled the crowbar from the floor. "We stay put and prepare. We don't open the door for anything. No, matter what it says or looks like." Ava reached behind her seat and pulled out the bear spray. "This won't stop them. You know that, right?" "I know," Spencer said, "but it might buy us a few seconds." Clarissa wiped her face with the sleeve of her shirt and found the tire iron beneath her seat. "We need something sharp, something that can actually hurt them." "There's nothing in here sharp enough," Ava said. "Then we make do with what we have," Spencer replied. The sun was beginning its slow descent. The trees cast longer shadows now, and the temperature had begun to drop. Spencer adjusted the crowbar in his hands and looked out through the bullet-scarred windshield, watching the trees sway. "They'll come back," he said. "We know," Clarissa replied. And still they waited. The forest changed with the falling dark. Shadows pooled at the base of trunks, swallowing whole patches of earth that moments ago had been visible. What warmth the afternoon had offered was gone. Now the air turned damp and still. Inside the Jeep, the three of them sat in silence. The crowbar rested heavily across Spencer's lap. Clarissa held the bear spray close to her chest. Ava hadn't spoken in some time, her eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, though there was nothing in it. The mimics had been gone for almost an hour, but none of them believed they were truly alone. The sound began faintly. Soft footsteps against underbrush, like someone pacing intentionally just out of sight. A moment later, the first figure emerged from between the trees. At first, Spencer thought it was Clarissa. Same long legs, same lean hips, same dark waves of hair framing a face, equal parts daring and unbothered. But this version wore her clothing from earlier in the day. The cut-off shorts, the ribbed tank top, the sunglasses still pushed up over her head. The mimic strolled casually out into the open, pausing in the road. Then it reached for the hem of its shirt. It lifted the fabric slowly, baring its stomach, then its chest. No bra underneath. The exposed breasts, Clarissa's exactly, bounced slightly as the shirt came over the head and was tossed aside. Then the mimic slid a hand across its abdomen, down between its thighs, where it rubbed idly over the denim. Spencer sat up straighter. Another figure stepped out behind it, Ava this time. Or rather, a perfect mirror of her, complete down to the faint line of a scar on her left shoulder and the slight inward curve of her knees. This mimic wore the same t-shirt and leggings Ava had worn hiking, though they had been carefully tugged to emphasize her figure. The mimic Ava ran her hands through her hair and then slowly peeled the shirt over her head, revealing a lace bra. Before Spencer could so much as stutter, it removed the garment and tossed it into the woods. Her pants followed, slipped off in slow rhythm, until she stood completely bare beneath the moonlight. Inside the car, no one spoke. The Clarissa mimic approached first, hips swaying with exaggerated rhythm, her hands now cupping her breasts as she stared directly at Spencer through the windshield. "Spence," she whispered. Her voice was identical. "I've seen the way you look at me." Spencer's throat tightened. "I know what you think about when you're alone," the mimic said. "I know what you want to do to me, what you want me to do to you." Behind her, the Ava mimic pressed herself against the driver's side window. She leaned in and mouthed something seductively. Spencer couldn't hear the words, but he could read her lips. "I want you inside me." Clarissa tensed beside him. "Don't listen. Don't watch." "I'm not," he started, but his voice came out brittle. "Yes, you are," Ava hissed from across the seat. "You're watching." He was. The Clarissa mimic dragged her hands down her stomach again, then slid them between her thighs. Her eyes stayed fixed on him, her mouth parted. Her fingers moved in slow, measured circles, and when she moaned, it was exactly the way Clarissa had once laughed at a joke he'd made, full and warm and private. Then the mimic climbed onto the hood. She knelt there naked, lit only by the faint glow of the moon and the dull gleam of the broken headlight. She spread her legs. Her hand didn't leave her body. The other reached down, picked up something from the gravel, a discarded leaf, and traced it between her breasts. "Come on, Spence," she said, her voice husky. "Open the door." He looked away. The Ava mimic tapped lightly on the glass. Her breasts were pressed flat against it now, leaving fogged outlines. She reached down and began to mimic Clarissa's movements. "Let us in," she said. "We'll take care of you. You're not real," he muttered. "We feel real," Clarissa's voice said. Then came another form, another Spencer. This copy emerged from the dark wearing his shirt, his jeans. It walked like him, smirked like him. And as it drew closer, it began to strip as well, slowly unbuttoning his pants, peeling off his shirt, exposing the same birthmark on the hip, the same awkward lean muscles. The Spencer mimic approached the Clarissa mimic on the hood. "No," Spencer said. The mimic ignored him. It reached out and took Clarissa's hand. Together they lay back against the windshield. Her legs wrapped around his waist. Her moans grew louder. Her nails dug into his shoulders, his own shoulders. And then as Spencer sat frozen, she lowered her mouth to his copy's visibly engorged groin. Clarissa gasped aloud inside the car. No, this isn't happening." The mimic on the hood moved with slow, exaggerated rhythm, allowing her moans to echo off the glass between them. Spencer watched himself throw his head back, mouth open, face contorted in pleasure. He tried to look away, but the sound wouldn't stop. Then the mimic climaxed him, his mimic, and pulled back, allowing the product of its efforts to spatter across the windshield. Clarissa screamed. Ava turned her head and covered her ears. The Clarissa mimic wiped the streak of fluids across the glass and pressed her face to it, tongue dragging a crooked trail upward. She smiled through the mess. Spencer couldn't breathe. "That's not me," he said. But it looked like him, and in spite of the grotesquerie of the situation, he could not deny his arousal, nor his shame. When the mimics finally pulled away, retreating like dancers from a stage, still naked, still smiling, the damage had been done. The glass bore smears of sweat and other fluids. The hood still held the outline of two bodies. The night no longer felt quiet. Clarissa turned her face to the door and wept. Ava said nothing. Spencer stared out into the trees, his grip on the crowbar unbroken. The worst part wasn't the performance, it wasn't the voices or the sounds or the act itself. It was the simple fact that, for a moment, Some part of him had wanted it. Their reprieve was short-lived. The knock came soft at first, 3 dull thumps against the hood as though whoever made them lacked the strength to raise their arm above the elbow. Spencer sat up fast, crowbar at the ready, and peered through the windshield, his eyes adjusting quickly to the bruised blackness that had settled over everything. The others stirred beside him, still half stunned from the last ordeal. Ava reached for the flashlight but didn't turn it on. Clarissa muttered something inaudible and then fell silent. A shape hunched in the headlights, crawling forward from the shoulder like a wounded animal. For a moment, none of them recognized it. The posture was wrong, limp and sagging as if it had been dropped from a great height. But as the thing drew closer, dragging one knee, one palm slick against the gravel, the familiarity sank in. "Ricky," Clarissa whispered, though her voice held no certainty. The figure came into full view, collapsing just feet from the bumper. His hair was matted with blood. One eye was swollen completely shut. His shirt hung in tatters, revealing ribs that looked bruised to the point of fracturing. His lips moved, but no words came at first, only wet, broken breath. He tried again. "Help. Please. It's me." Spencer was conflicted. Even through the grime and the blood and the slackness in his features, it looked like Ricky. Not the mask-like imitations from earlier, not the theatrical puppet play the mimics had used to taunt them. This version shook with pain. This version bled. He coughed hard and spat something black and viscous into the gravel. "It could be another trick," Ava said, but she didn't sound convinced. "You saw what they did? They can make themselves look like anything." Spencer was already unbuckling his seatbelt. "No," Clarissa said, grabbing his arm. "Don't. I have to know," he said. "If it's him, we can't leave him out there." He cracked open the door slowly, careful not to let it swing wide. The night air was chill in comparison to the temperature of the Jeep's suffocating interior, and with it came the sharp, coppery tang of blood. The figure on the ground groaned again. Spencer kept the crowbar in one hand as he stepped forward. "Don't move," he said. "Just lie still. I need to ask you something." The figure nodded, or tried to. His head dipped forward and stayed, there, trembling. "What were you drinking when you met Clarissa?" Spencer asked, a pause. "Beer," the thing said, wheezing. Spencer's fingers tightened around the crowbar. "What's tattooed on your back?" A second pause. Longer this time. "Anchor." "No," Spencer whispered. "Not even close." He took a step backward. The figure lifted its head slowly. The face, so damaged, so close to real, split into a grin. Teeth dark with blood gleamed behind cracked lips. "We've got you now," it hissed. "You should have locked the doors." Then it shrieked, not in pain or alarm, but in triumph. The woods exploded with movement. Branches split, leaves scattered. Shadows took form and rushed forward. Spencer turned, bolting back to the car. But it was too late. The door had already been opened. Clarissa was screaming. Ava was shouting something. His name or hers or both. But the voices were drowned beneath the thunder of limbs striking metal, hands slapping glass, claws dragging grooves into paint and flesh alike. One of the windows blew out as a mimic tore. Through it with a piece of rebar sharpened to a spike. Spencer threw himself at the side of the car only to be grabbed from behind. Fingers dug into his shoulders, another pair wrapped around his waist. They didn't feel like hands anymore. They were too cold, too strong. He dropped the crowbar, trying to twist free, and someone or something ripped open his shirt. And then they changed. They took Clarissa's face first. 2 of them, grinning wide and naked, pressing themselves against him. Their mouths were too warm. Their breath smelled wrong. One kissed his neck while the other whispered filth in his ear. Things she had never said, things no one should have said in that voice. Then came Ava's face. Another mouth. Another set of hands. All of them pawing, caressing, luring him into a trap that had no exit. They pulled him to the ground and he landed hard on his back. Above him, the mimics formed a circle. All of them were Clarissa, Ava, or him. The Spencer copies watched him with mirrored eyes as they leaned in close. Their skin rippled like something beneath it was moving too fast for the flesh to contain. One, Clarissa thing mounted him, grinding against his hips. It moaned, and the sound was perfect. The timing was perfect. Then it bit him. The pain was sharp, bright, jagged. It bit again, lower this time, tearing muscle from thigh. Another sank its teeth into his shoulder. The others followed, mouths open, teeth flashing. They fed in unison, tearing, ripping, devouring. Not just hungry, but worshipful, as if this act was sacrament. He screamed until blood filled his throat. His last thought was of Clarissa, real Clarissa, watching it all happen. And then he didn't think anymore. Inside the car, Clarissa had managed to pull Ava across the seat and slam the door shut again. The mimic Spencer outside was still clawing at the roof, his face now soaked in real blood. The girls fumbled for the bear spray and swung at anything near the window. A mimic lunged forward, and Clarissa drove the crowbar through its arm. The thing didn't scream. It didn't even flinch. It only looked at her with Spencer's face and whispered, "You felt so good. I want more, Clarissa. The real thing." She opened the door and ran. Ava followed, stumbling over the gravel, tears blurring her vision. The trees loomed ahead, but the shadows moved faster than they could. Mimics slipped out from behind the trunks. More Clarissas, more Spencers, more Avas. All of them naked, all of them slick with blood and smiling too wide. Clarissa screamed when they caught her. Ava turned and saw it happen. Spencer's mimic holding her down while two others began to eat. Clarissa's mouth opened wide, but the sound was cut off as teeth found her throat. Then they were on Ava. She kicked, thrashed, and screamed, but it didn't matter. One by one, they tore her apart. The wrecker's headlights pierced the forest in two narrow beams, catching only the first few trunks before the trees swallowed the light whole. The road ahead looked emptier than Ricky remembered. He leaned forward in the passenger seat, jaw clenched, every muscle in his legs still knotted from the sprint that had carried him through the woods and back to the ranger station. The tow truck rumbled over a ridge and began its descent. Behind them, the sheriff's SUV followed in low gear, its light bar off, its spots casting a thin white blade along the tree line. The driver beside Ricky shifted in his seat. "You sure this is it?" "I'm sure," Ricky said. His voice was rough. It felt like someone had taken sandpaper to his throat. "You weren't making a lot of sense back at the station. You said something about people wearing your face?" Ricky didn't answer. When they came around the last bend, the high beams fell on what remained of the Jeep. The vehicle looked like it had been attacked by something clawed. The driver's side door had been torn half off, dangling on its hinge. The roof was dented inward, glass strewn across the dirt. One of the tires had been shredded. The others looked slashed straight through. Across the hood, dried blood had streaked into long, oily lines. The sheriff pulled up behind them and stepped out with a flashlight. He swept it across the ditch, then the open rear of the Jeep, where what remained of a sleeping bag had been, crumpled beneath something red and soaked through. A crowbar lay bent in the dirt. "What the hell?" the tow driver whispered. The sheriff crouched. "Bullet holes," he said, shining the beam upward. 3, maybe 4. Exit wounds, through the roof. Blood everywhere, some of it fresh. Ricky stepped down from the truck, legs stiff and unreliable, and walked slowly toward the open passenger side. The door had been kicked open, or pulled. There were no bodies, but the floor was smeared with handprints, some pressed in blood, others streaked as if someone had tried to hold on while being dragged out. He circled the car. There were drag marks in the gravel, knees, fingertips, boot prints, his own, and bare feet. Dozens of them crossing over one another, weaving in circles. The spacing was wrong, the rhythm broken. "Where are the others?" the driver asked. "They were here," Ricky said. "I left to get help." "You left them stranded out here?" the sheriff asked. There was no accusation in his voice, not yet, just disbelief. There was no better choice. Someone had to get help. "And what do you think happened then?" the sheriff asked. "They were surrounded." "By what?" Ricky looked into the trees. "Things that looked like us. Hungry things." The sheriff stood, hands on his belt. "I'll need to take you in, you understand. There's blood, damage, and missing people. We'll need a formal statement, some testing." Ricky nodded, still watching the tree line. You're not going to find anything. We'll get a team up here in daylight and do a full investigation. I assure you we'll find out what happened to your friends. Ricky's eyes moved back to the road. Everything will be gone before then. That's how it works. The tow driver took a cautious step back toward his truck. What are you talking about, son? Do you mean bears? Cartel grow ops? What kind of... I told you they looked like us, Ricky repeated. Moved like us, talked like us, but they weren't right. The sheriff raised his light again. No signs of struggle beyond the car. No tracks heading into the woods. No blood trail that leads anywhere. You don't get it, Ricky said. They're gone. There's nothing left of them. He walked to the rear of the vehicle and stood in silence for a long time, staring at a patch of gravel where the pattern had been broken, where something had knelt, maybe even sat, before disappearing into the dark. Behind him, the sheriff and tow driver exchanged glances. The sheriff radioed for backup, but Ricky wasn't listening anymore. His eyes were on the trees, and in the deepest recess between trunks, just where the shadows bled into one another, something shifted. It didn't come forward or move toward the light, but it was there. A tall, familiar figure, standing still. The tilt of its head was unmistakable. Clarissa, or rather something wearing her face. A moment later, a second shorter figure joined her, one with narrower shoulders and its hair pulled back. Ava. They didn't wave or blink. They simply watched. Then a third form stepped between them. Him, Ricky, felt his breath leave his body, and he closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the trees were still and the figures were gone. 2 months later. The noise of the city didn't help. Sirens were just new versions of screams. Footsteps in the hall became whispers against the glass. Ricky kept his curtains drawn and the lights off most nights, not because he thought it would keep them away, but because he knew it wouldn't. He hadn't spoken to the press, hadn't returned the messages from Clarissa's parents, hadn't been back to campus. The sheriff's office had run their investigation, combed the crash site again in daylight, and sent divers to nearby creeks. But there were no bodies, no official leads, suspects, or motives. There were obvious signs of foul play, but nothing that could be proven or tied to anyone in particular. The official conclusion was that a group of college students had gotten lost, had a good time at first, but then later panicked and likely succumbed to exposure, and perhaps were attacked by animals such as wolves or bears. They concluded further that Ricky had likely been suffering from trauma-induced delusions and recommended that he seek counseling. Ricky knew better, and sometimes late at night, he saw them again. They never came into the house, but they stood beneath the streetlights across from his apartment, where the light fell just short of their feet. Sometimes it was Clarissa, her hair still matted with blood, styled the way it had been before she died. Other times it was Ava, clutching the crowbar they'd left behind. And sometimes it was him, copy after copy, standing shoulder to shoulder, heads tilted at the same angle, all observing from the shadows. And on the very worst nights, it wasn't them at all, but something new, something that wasn't wearing anyone's face yet, something waiting to choose one. Frame drop. Derek Knowles had long since accepted that he wasn't going to be anyone's idea of successful. He hadn't gone viral. He wasn't editing splashy commercial reels for film studios. He wasn't winning short film awards or teaching online courses on how to build your brand. Most days he was lucky if he could pay rent on time. But the late-night gigs, those unmarked drives full of corrupted horror reels, footage from busted VHS tapes, and unreleased grindhouse junk, those paid in volume. And Derek, with his windowless one-bedroom and his caffeine and codeine diet, had time to burn. The contract came in under the subject line, catalog work, restoration, compensation flat rate, plus bonus, from a group calling itself Dead, Light Archives. He hadn't heard of them before. Their website was a single black page with a flashing red enter button and a low-res video loop of a hand holding up a burning cassette. No about section, no credits, no contact name. Just a bulk of download links and a numbered checklist of what to convert, export, and deliver. Still, the pay wasn't terrible. And Derek had worked with weirder. He spent most of that first night dragging massive file folders into Adobe Premiere, cross-referencing corrupted runtimes with the client's logs. A few of the videos were labeled generically, Tape 14, Segment F13, or Untitled Shot C, but others were marked by hand, their file names preserved from scanned cassette sleeves. Do not rewind tape eyes. She lives between the frames. Derek smirked when he saw those. Every horror subculture had its gimmicks. This was probably someone's art house ARG, the kind that leaned into nostalgic creep with degraded filters and analog rot. He made a mental note to clean the audio later and kept working. He had 42 hours of footage to transfer before the first delivery window closed. By 2 a.m., Derek had cleared over a dozen files. Most of the footage was unremarkable. Badly lit hallways, disjointed scenes from half-shot horror shorts, and a few sections that looked like security footage but didn't seem to capture anything at all. Occasionally, there was a clip that flickered with a bit of atmosphere, an actress wearing deer antlers crawling through an abandoned school, or a set piece filled with waterlogged dolls and red lights. But for the most part, it was the same flavorless material that had passed through his hands 100 times before. It wasn't until he exported Tape Eyes AVI that something shifted. The render finished without error, but when Derek reviewed the output, he noticed an anomaly. A single frame inserted between two static shots. One moment, the footage showed a man walking into a dark room. The next, for less than a quarter of a second, it flashed a still image, a grainy forest scene, unlit and monochrome, trees bent inward as if leaning towards something out of frame. Derek scrubbed back through the timeline. The frame wasn't visible on the source footage. There were no keyframes, no embedded metadata, and no motion on the track that would explain its appearance. He double-checked the project files, suspecting corruption or a faulty plugin. Nothing unusual surfaced. He exported it again. The forest frame remained. Derek opened his production log and jotted down the details. Tape Eyes AAVE. Foreign frame detected. Approx timestamp 00.134719. Appears mid-cut. Not in source. Timeline static bleed. Review again later. He told himself it was just a software hiccup. These files were pulled from ancient media. Some of them had probably been played and re-recorded dozens of times, each pass degrading the signal further. Digital artifacts weren't uncommon when upscaling analog formats, especially from PAL to NTSC. The idea that one corrupted frame might slip past quality control wasn't anything to panic over. Still, it stuck with him. The scene itself had no forest, no outdoor sequences, no transitions that should have led into woods. Just a man walking through a hallway cut to black, and then the next segment. But that one image, that forest, it had no reason to be there. Closed his laptop around 4 in the morning and tried to sleep. The frame flickered behind his eyelids. The next night, Derek returned to the project with less skepticism and more curiosity. He didn't expect to find the forest frame again, but part of him wanted to. The logical part of his brain insisted it would be gone, that some glitch in the preview pipeline had simply fed him a corrupted render. That belief held for the first few hours of work, until he reached the re-edit of a file marked She Lives Frame 139.move. It started with the same inconsistencies, static flickers between cuts, audio degradation that worsened in sync with hard transitions, and a noticeable distortion in the upper third of the frame. Derek scrubbed through the footage manually, frame by frame, to confirm the timing before the export. And then he saw it. Not just the forest. That frame was back, nearly identical to the one from the previous file. But this time it was followed by another. A mouth, wide open and contorted in a frozen scream, its tongue twisted unnaturally against yellow teeth. The image was out of place, inserted mid-edit with no transition. It didn't belong to the scene. It didn't belong anywhere. Derek sat back from the monitor and let the playback loop. Forest, scream, static, return to original footage, No visual break or fade between. He clicked back to the timeline and opened the file's metadata. Once again, the inserted frames weren't present on the track itself. They existed only in the render preview, as if being revealed selectively. To him, he opened his log again. Second anomaly, timestamp approx. 00004 03.02. Mouth frozen in scream. Separate frame following forest. No visible keyframes. Possible interlacing artifact? Review audio waveform. The note felt dishonest. He already knew what this wasn't. It wasn't data loss. It wasn't tape bleed or dropped frames or anything he'd seen in 15 years of editing. This was deliberate. He played the two anomalous frames again and noticed something else. The screaming mouth looked wet. The lighting didn't match the rest of the footage either. It looked newer, crisper, as if it had been inserted from a modern camera using an analog filter to mask its origin. For a moment, Derek considered emailing the client. Not to complain, but to ask whether they'd embedded any sort of viral content or AR puzzle in the files. He'd worked with alternate reality marketers before. Some used similar techniques, subliminal inserts, fake errors, seeded mysteries, to build buzz online. But something about this didn't feel like marketing. He didn't write the email. Instead, he leaned forward, stared into the face of that forest, and scrubbed backward through the project again. Something had changed. He wasn't just editing anymore. Something else was happening between the frames, and it wanted him to keep going. The following night, Derek skipped dinner and logged into his workstation the moment the sun disappeared behind the curtainless slats of his living room window. The familiar hum of his desktop fans filled the room as he loaded the next batch of files from Deadlight archives. His apartment smelled faintly of burnt plastic and old coffee filters, but he no longer noticed it. All of his attention was fixed on the project queue where the anomalous footage sat. Instead of continuing with the next sequence, Derek reopened the folder labeled She Lives Frame 139.move and pulled the render into his timeline once again. He slowed the playback to a crawl, examining every single frame surrounding the anomalies, the screaming mouth, the black forest, the stutter of static that framed them. There was no transition, no crossfade, no visual echo that would suggest the material had come from an adjacent clip. He dragged the insertion points frame by frame, isolating the disturbance at the timestamp 0040302. There was no associated audio spike, no visual identifier embedded into the metadata. When he examined the rendered clip at the file level, the anomalies were present. But when he opened the source files separately, they were gone. It was as though the frames were being added after the edit, not from within the sequence but from outside it. As if something was watching the edit in real time and inserting footage in the intervals between certainty. By midnight, Derek had built a dedicated timeline containing only the anomalies. At first it was just the forest and the screaming mouth repeated with only slight variations in contrast, but then a new frame appeared. This one showed a woman's face. She was pale and thin, her features angular but symmetrical. Her mouth was closed, but the expression was far from neutral. Her skin bore the sickly waxen sheen of something preserved in time. Black fluid streaked from her eyes and followed the contours of her cheeks. It ran in thin lines down her jaw and disappeared into the darkened collar of what looked like a hospital gown. But what disturbed Derek most wasn't the image itself. It was the way her eyes aligned with the screen. When he moved his cursor, her pupils seemed to follow. He tested this again. Dragging the mouse in small circles near the corner of the screen, he observed that her gaze shifted in tandem. There was no logical explanation for this, no interactivity coded into a static frame, no reason for a still image to behave like a video game avatar. He froze the timeline and leaned back. His hands hovering over the keyboard had started to tremble. There had to be an explanation. Perhaps someone had embedded a real-time gaze tracking effect, an augmented overlay meant to simulate interactivity. But when he reviewed the timeline at the source, the frame was just a single JPEG without layers. The illusion, if it was an illusion, was behaving like something sentient. He right-clicked the clip and selected Remove Frame. Nothing happened. He tried again. The editing software hiccuped, flickering once before returning to the same frame. The woman's face remained unchanged. Her black tears looked fresh, as if they had only just begun to dry. Frustrated, Derek toggled the audio waveform beneath the clip, hoping to isolate a silent command or a stray frequency that might explain the corruption. As he dragged the playhead forward, the speakers hissed to life with an eruption of white noise, followed by a single phrase spoken beneath the static. Keep watching. It was not a voice embedded in the project timeline. It came from the system itself, a glitching whisper that hovered just above the range of comfort. Derek slammed the spacebar, silencing the playback. He stared at the monitor, ears ringing, unsure if what he had heard was real or the consequence of exhaustion. The woman's face was still there. He turned off the volume entirely and exited the project without saving. For the first time in years, he felt genuine fear. Not the anxious kind that haunted late deadlines, but the kind that made one feel watched by someone or something intending to do harm. An hour later, after pacing the apartment and splashing his face with cold water, Derek opened his encrypted chat client and dug up the contact for someone he hadn't spoken to in over 2 years. Derek. Juno. It's Derek. Are you there? Juno. You still exist? Derek. I need your help with a project. Something's off. You still doing signal analysis? Juno. Depends. Is this freelance or a slow-motion breakdown? Derek. Could be both. Sending a sample now. He uploaded a render of the forest, the screaming mouth and the woman's face bundled together in a password-locked archive. A few minutes passed before Juno responded. Juno. That's not glitching. That's glyphing. He stared at the message, unsure what to make of it. Derek. Glyphing? Like symbolic language? Juno. Exactly. But not from the footage. From the signal. Give me 24 hours. I'm feeding this through a few of my models. You'll want a coffee and a stiff drink when I send back what I find. Derek thanked her and logged off. The rest of the night passed in silence, broken only by the occasional hum of his external hard drives spinning down. The next day, Derek received a zip file and a message. You're not editing a film, you're finishing a ritual. Inside, the folder was a series of frames Juno had extracted from the footage, enhanced with signal isolation techniques he didn't entirely understand. Between every frame Derek had flagged, especially the one containing the woman's face, Juno had uncovered subtle distortions not visible to the naked eye. These distortions, when aligned, formed symbols, not ones Derek recognized. These weren't part of any known script, not even the sigils used in internet hoaxes or digital witchcraft blogs. Juno had cross-referenced the patterns with various occult databases and found fragments of a match in a digitized copy of a 1970s manuscript on ceremonial film magic. A fringe belief that claimed certain patterns of light, when played in sequence, could function as binding glyphs to contain non-physical entities. The file she attached included a quote from the manuscript: "Entities bound by the flicker of frame and rhythm of edit do not die. They loop, and if left unspooled, they reassemble." Derek closed the file and sat in the dim glow of his monitors. Every sound in his apartment suddenly sharper. The radiator's hiss resembled a breath. The subtle creak in the ceiling, a footfall. He opened the project timeline one more time and zoomed into the woman's face. Her eyes no longer tracked the cursor. Instead, they stared directly into the lens, as if they had finally found what they were waiting for. Part 3. Derek hadn't left his apartment in 3 days. The light that filtered through the thin slats above his kitchen sink had begun to feel foreign, like something borrowed from another reality. Every time he blinked, he saw the woman's face, not as a memory, but as an imprint on his visual field, haunting the periphery of everything he looked at. Her eyes remained motionless now, but her presence lingered in the shadows between thoughts. The edits continued, though Derek no longer remembered starting them. He would wake in his chair, a fresh timeline open, partially rendered sequences, already arranged and labeled in his project bins. Each file bore names he didn't recognize. Window sequence 06, hallway static, living room tape arrow 2. When he played them back, the footage was unmistakably his. Not metaphorically, not aesthetically, literally his. Recorded from inside his own apartment, from angles that suggested hidden cameras or secondary devices, none of which he owned. One clip showed him asleep on the couch, beneath a blanket he hadn't used in years. Another captured a view from inside the bathroom mirror, as if the glass had recorded the room by itself. A third showed him standing completely still in the hallway, back turned to the camera, motionless for nearly 4 full minutes. The timestamps were all from the previous night. He checked every connected device for spyware, malware, backdoors, anything that could explain the origin of the footage. Nothing appeared. His routers showed no signs of intrusion. His local storage reported no new file transfers. It was as if the footage had bypassed every layer of protocol and written itself directly to disk. At first, Derek wondered if he had been sleepwalking. The idea brought him a small comfort, as absurd as it seemed, but that comfort died when he checked his old analog camcorder, the one he hadn't used since college, and discovered that its cassette was missing. The device had been powered on, and its date-time settings had been updated to the current week. Someone or something had used it, and now the footage was spliced into his timeline. It was around 4 a.m. when he first noticed the static had spread beyond his screens. The microwave display flickered with white noise, indecipherable characters scrolling by too quickly to parse. His smartphone's lock screen was no longer functional. Instead, it glowed dimly with a blank video frame that refreshed every few seconds. Even his bathroom mirror shimmered faintly around the edges. He tested the mirror by turning off all the lights and watching the glass surface. What he saw was not his reflection, but a playback delay, 3 seconds behind his actual movements. When he stepped forward, the reflection followed a moment later, blinking at intervals that did not match his own. It wasn't his reflection. It was a projection. The edits had begun bleeding into reality. By the time he reached back out to Juno, Derek's voice had become hoarse. He hadn't spoken aloud in days. They connected through a secure audio call. Juno refused to use video under any circumstances. I fed more of the signal into my pattern extrapolator, she said without greeting. It's not just glyphs. It's alignment sequencing. You're building something, not narratively, visually. There's a cadence to the way the frames appear. Symmetry, repetition, intentional degradation. Derek paced his apartment while she spoke, eyes flicking, between the dead television set and the laptop still rendering a batch of files in the background. Then it's not random, he said. I'm not losing my mind. Something's controlling the insertions. Worse, Juno replied. You're enabling them. There's a term in old media theory, splice point. It's when an edit becomes not just a transition, but a bridge. Something that lets two incompatible sources bleed into each other. In cinema, it's aesthetic. In ritual design, it's foundational. You think the edits are forming a ritual structure? I know they are. I mapped the repeating intervals. They form a spiral glyph, one that only completes when enough. Footage has been rendered in a precise sequence. That spiral isn't just symbolic, it's a key, a lockpick. Once it completes, something gets through. There was a long pause. Derek stopped walking. You know what it is, don't you? I don't know its name, Juno said, her voice lower now. But I've seen pieces of it before. There were forums in the early 2000s, obscure ones hosted, out of Japan and Eastern Europe. People posted stories about footage that couldn't be erased, tapes that filmed you while you slept, projects that finished themselves when left unattended. The posts always ended the same way. User accounts deactivated, no further updates, contact lost. I thought that was urban legend. They were urban legends, she said, until someone strung enough of them together. The entity you're Dealing with, it's not cursed content. It's a being, a fragmented intelligence that survives through old media. VHS, Betamax, reel to reel. The footage is its flesh. The edit is its spine. You're helping it reassemble. And if I stop, don't think you can anymore. You're too far in. It's splicing you now. That night, Derek watched one of the early clips from Tape Eyes, this time letting it run in its entirety. Halfway through the footage, the camera panned across a television set playing static. Reflected in the screen was a man standing completely, still holding a lantern in one hand and a tangle of black cords in the other. His face was a pale smear. The longer Derek looked at it, the more he became convinced the man wasn't standing in the room being filmed. He was looking out of the television. In another clip, marked Recovered Sequence 1987, a woman could be seen hunched over a film reel, manually splicing together strips of damaged footage. Her hands moved with erratic precision, as if guided by a rhythm not audible on the tape. At one point, she looked up directly into the camera and mouthed something. Derek enhanced the clip. Her lips formed a single phrase. "Don't finish it." He cataloged the file and checked the project notes. According to Deadlight Archives metadata, the woman's name was likely Valerie Harrow, a film archivist employed by a short-lived independent distributor in 1987. The distributor dissolved under suspicious circumstances following a studio fire. No cause had ever been found. Valerie's body was never recovered. A search of digitized obituaries revealed several names that matched the credits in the files Derek had already edited. Cinematographers, Foley artists, and even a few independent directors. All of them had died unexpectedly, many listed as suicides or accidents during post-production. None had completed their final projects. He returned to his project queue and reviewed the master timeline. The spiral structure Juno had described was now plainly visible. The clips were aligning. The footage had begun looping back on itself, incorporating material from his own apartment, mirroring the scenes from 30 years earlier. A new folder appeared in the root directory of his system. Final cut pending inside. There were 3 files. Spiral completion, Rend 012. Live, capture, 2013. Der Knowles Lupi. Hadn't created any of them. He hadn't rendered them. But they were dated for tonight, and each was set to run automatically at 3:33 a.m. Part before Derek no longer recognized the room around him. The walls still held the shape of his apartment, but their surfaces had begun to ripple in places, as if reacting to a heat source just beyond sight. Beneath the pale green paint, a thin weave of static buzzed faintly, visible only when the lights dimmed and the flickering began. He had tested the bulbs. He had replaced every breaker and checked the wiring behind the socket plates. The problem wasn't electrical. The lights were blinking in Morse code. It began the previous night. 3 short flashes, 3 long, 3 short again, SOS. He recorded the flickers with his phone, then played them back frame by frame to confirm the pattern. It repeated every 47 seconds, and between each cycle his furniture would shift slightly. The couch rotated a few degrees counterclockwise. The kitchen chair moved half an inch toward the hallway. His microwave door swung, open on its own only to be closed again minutes later. He started placing tape on the floor to mark the positions, but the tape itself began to peel and curl at the edges, like film left too long in the sun. The apartment had become a part of the footage. The boundaries between the physical world and the edit bay had collapsed, and something inside the reels was rewriting both. In his project folder, Derek found 3 new files. They had appeared after midnight with no render logs, no source trail, and no author metadata. When he opened the first one, Live Sleep DK103.move, he saw himself lying in bed, arms crossed over his chest, eyes closed but twitching beneath the lids. The footage was grainy, shot from the ceiling at an angle he had no means to replicate. His camcorder wasn't mounted there. No lens in his possession could have captured that viewpoint. Yet the timestamp matched the exact moment he remembered waking with a nosebleed and a dull ache in the back of his skull. The second file, Juno endburning.mp4 was shorter, less than 15 seconds. It showed a fire in what looked like a studio, filled with analog equipment and shelves of cassettes. Flames rose behind a figure seated at a desk, hunched over a CRT monitor. The image was heavily degraded, but he could tell it was Juno. Her hair was pulled into the same braided bun she had worn during their last call. She didn't move. The fire climbed higher, bending around her in perfect silence, as though afraid to touch her directly. But the screen in front of her glowed brighter with each passing second, displaying a series of sigils. The third file, SPCR Walkthrough AVI, opened to a slow pan down a hallway filled with stacked VHS tapes. The perspective moved as though handheld by a figure not entirely steady. The tapes bore labels from the Dead Light archives. Derek recognized some of them. Tape Eyes, Frame 139 Val Harrow Raw. The camera turned. At the end of the corridor stood a figure in black, its form flickering at the edges like a poorly tracked signal. In its right hand, it held an old brass lantern. In the other, it dragged a length of magnetic tape that unraveled across the floor like a severed vein. It had no face, only a vertical slit where the features should have been, leaking static like blood from an open wound. Derek slammed. The laptop closed and pushed back from his desk. His chair rolled against the warped floorboards and tilted slightly, as if the ground itself had begun to slope. He knew now what was happening. The splicer was nearly through. Juno responded to his message within minutes. She didn't greet him. Her voice, when it came through the encrypted call, was sharp. "I saw it too," she said. "The fire, the real room. That wasn't symbolic. That was predictive rendering. It's using the ritual spiral to forecast events and overwrite them into the sequence. You're saying it's showing us the future? I'm saying it's scripting the future, injecting scenes like it does with frames. The difference is now the edits aren't bound to footage. They're bound to us." Derek stood in the center of his living room, watching his reflection slide across every dark surface. "Then how do we break the sequence?" "We don't break it," she said. "We trap it again, like the archivists did before. There's a glyph. I isolated it from the fire sequence. A recursive symbol designed to collapse the spiral inward. Think of it like a kill switch, a frame that contradicts the loop structure and forces a reset. Will it work? If we embed it into a master reel composed entirely of edited fragments, yes, but it can't be digital. The splicer exists within analog structure. We need a physical tape, something it recognizes." Derek scanned the shelves where he kept his old reels. Most were commercial tapes, blank, unformatted, or dubs of obscure horror shorts. He pulled 6 at random and began prying open the casings. The inside smelled like dust and vinegar, and the reels were warped with age. But they would do. "We build it," Juno said. "From scratch. A Frankenstein tape made of sacrificial footage. Every haunted reel, every cursed frame, spliced together in a single unbroken chain. The final glyph gets inserted at the end, and you burn it to tape at exactly 3:33 a.m. Derek paused. "Why me?" "Because the ritual already sees you as the editor. You're the one who aligned the spiral. You're the final cut." The process of creating the tape took the better part of the day. Derek used an old tape splicer and a magnetic sync machine he hadn't touched since film school. The physical act of cutting and binding reels felt foreign now, as if he were stitching nerves instead of film. Each segment, he added, came from a different cursed reel. Grainy shots of staircases that never ended, pulsing tunnels, and faces distorted into perpetual loops of agony. He kept his gloves on throughout the assembly. By the time he reached the final segment, his hands had begun to shake involuntarily. Juno sent the glyph via encrypted image file. It looked like a spiral overlaid with a collapsing waveform, wrapped in recursive loops of sigils he could not interpret. He printed it onto a transparency sheet, then filmed it using his camcorder, playing it in reverse on an old CRT. The result was imperfect, but Juno assured him that imperfection was part of the seal. "Static must persist for contrast to form," she said. "It needs noise to define the boundary." At 3:27 a.m., Derek powered down everything except the VCR and the monitor and dimmed the lights. The walls flickered around him. He held the final tape in both hands. Somehow it felt denser than it should have, as if it carried more than magnetic data. As he approached the VCR, the static on the television gave way to blackness. A single line of white text appeared. Insert final cut sync at 3:33. Derek looked at the clock. 3:32:15. The countdown had already begun. He slid the tape into the VCR and pressed play. The screen crackled. The footage rolled. Forest, mouth, woman, flame, glyph. The edits looped with seamless rhythm, each frame locking into the next like gears in a machine tightening around itself. The glyph appeared in the final 10 seconds, flickering brighter with each pass. Derek felt the floor vibrate beneath him, as if the entire room had become a tuning fork struck by something beneath the earth. The wall behind the television began to peel back. Not the wallpaper or the paint, the wall itself. It curled like celluloid melting under a projector lamp. Behind it was nothing but raw static, a window into the signal's source. Through the opening stepped the splicer. It no longer flickered. It walked with complete form, a black silhouette with streamers of magnetic tape trailing behind it. The lantern it carried burned with film light, sepia, stuttering, barely coherent. Its face remained void, but its attention was undeniable. It had come for Derek. He held his ground. The final frame clicked into place. The screen went white and the glyph detonated in silence. Then the tape snapped. Derek stood at the center of the room. The apartment was silent, save for the faint clicking of cooling tape reels. Though the tape had snapped, the ritual had not ended. The screen remained white. The frame held, and something was still here. He checked the VCR. The tape had stopped moving, but the counter kept advancing, flickering numbers that made no chronological sense, counts that rewound and advanced simultaneously, each digit bleeding into the next. The signal hadn't severed, it had simply stalled, waiting for the final frame to complete itself. He turned to grab his phone, but the screen refused to unlock. It was stuck in a single looping frame, a photo of his apartment from over his shoulder, as though the camera had taken the picture on its own. He tapped the screen again. The image blurred, then reshaped into something else. It was still his apartment, but he was no longer in it. Juno answered on the second ring. Her voice came through distorted, slowed, as if being broadcast through water. "Derek, don't let it splice. He shouted into the receiver, but her words repeated, layered over themselves with increasing desynchronization. The call dropped, and her name disappeared from his contact list. When he tried to redial, the phone played a chime he had never heard before. A series of descending tones like a VHS fast-forward sound lowered 3 octaves. Then the screen cracked down the center. Not shattered, but split, as if something beneath the glass had finally pushed upward, seeking air. He dropped the phone. It didn't bounce. It simply flickered out of visibility. There was no doubt left in him. The ritual had demanded sacrifice, and the glyph had delivered only delay. He had been editing the entity into existence, yes, but now it was editing him. He moved to the workstation and reopened the software. The interface no longer resembled any known editing suite. The icons had shifted. The timeline was circular. A single asset sat at the center of the screen labeled Final Cut DK. It had no duration. It had no resolution. When he hovered over the name, the preview pane displayed a live feed of his own face, his eyes sunken and lit by static from nowhere. The splicer had not left. It was waiting for him to finish the sequence. Derek reached into the crate beneath his desk and retrieved the last unmarked reel. A blank VHS tape he had kept for sentimental reasons, never used, still sealed in its plastic. He tore it open and inserted it into the VCR, feeling the mechanical resistance of the machine engage with something older than circuitry. The tape would become the container, but the footage was no longer digital. It would have to be recorded, directly, in real time, in a single take. He pointed the camera at himself and pressed record. On screen, The living room walls warped and reset. Furniture flickered through states of disrepair. His body remained anchored, but his reflection in the blacked-out television bent at wrong angles, lifting its hands when his stayed still. Then, the splicer stepped into the frame. It emerged not through doorway or wall, but through cut, a straight jump at it from absence to presence. One frame empty, the next frame occupied. It carried its lantern in one hand, the glow of the flame illuminating old film strips that floated weightlessly around its form. It did not speak. Its face was still a smear, the vertical gash splitting deeper now, as if trying to open into something human. Derek held the camera steady. "This is the final cut," he said. "You're not splicing me." The entity tilted its head, and the lights around them dimmed until only the recording LED remained, red and unblinking. But it was too late. The signal had already begun rerouting. Derek's skin shifted, interlaced, briefly with scan lines, a ghost of pixels overlaying muscle. His voice, when he spoke again, echoed with delay. "I'm splicing you." And then he turned the camera on himself, lens aimed at his face, his eyes already glowing with residual signal bleed. The frame locked, the tape engaged, and he stepped into the feed. The television screen went black, the VCR stopped ticking. Nothing moved for a long time. Eventually, the room, whatever it now was, reset. No furniture remained, no person, only the yowl, faint outline of magnetic tape trailing out of the open mouth of the VCR. Somewhere far away, perhaps across town or across continents, a person browsing a new streaming platform called Deadlight Archives clicked through the home menu. A thumbnail appeared under the newly added tab. The Derek Cut. Runtime, Lev source, unknown. Format, composite. The user hesitated, then pressed play. For a moment the screen remained empty, then static, then a forest. A screaming mouth. A woman with black tears. Then Derek, looking directly at the viewer. A progress bar formed at the bottom of the screen and began crawling forward in tiny, uneven segments. At the top corner, a notification blinked once. Frame drop detected. Resyncing timeline.